everyone. So I'm going to be talking to you about resources. Now behind me we have an array of different resources. So that's renewable resources like water, forests, fog which is harvested with nets, and agricultural land. And then we also have extractive resources like gold, tungsten, coltan, and diamonds. So in my time at Gallatin, I've studied how people relate to their environment and to the natural resources given value within their communities. And I've particularly been interested in this in relation to conflict and cooperation. So over the past 20 years, we've seen conflicts over gold in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ghana, forests in places like Myanmar and the Philippines, water in places like India and Pakistan and Bolivia, poppy in Afghanistan, diamonds in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and oil and gas in places like the US and Canada and Colombia and the Middle East. So how do we understand these conflicts? There's really two main schools of thought. The first looks at the idea of the resource curse, the idea that where there are resources that have value, there will be conflict. Now this is an environmental determinist approach. It suggests that the environment determines conflict rather than socio-political things that may arise around resources. Now the second school of thought, which I subscribe to and have been very influenced by at my time in Gallatin, is a political ecology approach. So this is a subset of the field of cultural geography. And this basically says, and this is summed up well in a recent essay by Philippe Lebihan and Rosaline Duffy, where they say that political ecology looks at the causes and consequences of uneven power relations around natural resources in the environment. So this means that in order to understand resource conflicts, we have to understand how people are relating to the resources within their societies and what types of power relations are going on. So resources are all the things that I showed you before. But I also like to define it more broadly as things that are extracted from or derived from the natural world that are given or possess social, economic, political, and/or spiritual value. Furthermore, as Philippe Lebihan says, he's a geographer who's written about conflict and resources, who's been very influential in my own work. And he argues that resources both contribute to and reflect material culture. And furthermore, that the social relations and power relations that are embedded in that material culture are very important for understanding resource conflicts. Now, I've talked to you a lot about contemporary resource conflicts so far, and this has been an important part of my Gallatin career. But I've also been really interested in how texts and histories from long ago can show us how resources have always been embedded within cultures and help us to understand resources and human-environment relationships across a larger historical time span. This is something that political ecology has overlooked a little bit to this point and where I've positioned my senior project. So given that, let's take a step back about 1,000 years. So this is the Noel Codex, and it contains the manuscript of the epic poem Beowulf, which I'm sure some of you have heard of or read or encountered in various ways. So I encountered Beowulf in a class, and at the same time, I was in a class that looked at natural resources, development, and environmental concerns in the contemporary world. And because this is Gallatin, my mind didn't treat these two things differently. I started to see the interconnections between Beowulf and the class that I was in. So for my senior project, I've proposed a thought experiment. How does looking at Beowulf through the lens of resources and political ecology help us to understand how resources are embedded in cultures, and also help us to create an understanding of resources on a larger historical time span? Now, political ecologists, being social scientists, don't normally look at fictional texts as their source base. But as literary scholar Stephen Greenblatt has argued, great writers are specialists in cultural exchange. And furthermore, the texts that they create reflect and absorb the social energies and practices of the cultures that they were created in and about. So this is how I will look at Beowulf, as reflective of the social energies and practices at that time. Now, I will also argue that power relations between people are mediated by resources. So let's take a look at an example of this. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background, just assuming you haven't read the text. So basically, Beowulf, the hero, comes from Gallatin to help Hrothgar, the king of the Danes, with a problem that he's having. And this problem is that Grendel, a monster, has been terrorizing and killing his people, and no one has been able to defeat him. So Beowulf comes and he's able to defeat Grendel in hand-to-hand, very intense combat. And this quote is taken from the part in the text where Hrothgar and his queen Wealhtheow are bestowing Beowulf with gifts. So I want to especially draw your attention to the focus on materiality, the wrought gold, the arm bangles, the torque of gold, which the poet remarks is the most resplendent he's ever seen. You can imagine that these objects that are being exchanged here might look something like this. So this is the Staffordshire hoard. It was discovered in 2009, and it's a good example of what these objects might look like. But what I want to really draw attention to here is the power relations that are present within the flow of resources from one human to another. So in the gifting of these objects from Hrothgar and Wealhtheow to Beowulf, you see also a flow of power. And so you see thanks and recognition, and Wealhtheow uses the word comradeship in the previous slide. She's the one who's quoted. So what you see is that resources are mediating these power relationships, but they're also helping to bring people together. They're creating social cohesion, comradeship, cooperation. This is another example of some of the close-ups of some of the items in the hoard. So my next point is that resources have power because they are embedded in social relationships. And furthermore, their specific materiality, which I mean by that is the ways in which they interact with various people, the social practices around them, the way they feel, the way that people use them, are really important for understanding how resources interact in a society. So this also requires looking at resources as active. So this is a term that's been taken recently in cultural geography. And geographers Bruce Braun and Sarah Watmore talk about non-humans. So what they're talking about is technologies, objects, artifacts. I'm going to add resources to that. Not as passive, but as active, so that they're actually playing an active role in what they say are the social collectivities and political associations of that time. So let's take a look at another example. So this is from the part in the story where the last remaining member of a community is burying a hoard of resources that his community no longer has need for because he's the last one. And he starts speaking to the earth, and he's lamenting the loss of the social practices around the resources. He's lamenting the loss of someone to bear a sword, or burnish plated goblets, or put a sheen on the cup. So what you see here is the importance of social relations in making the value of resources. He also then goes on to talk about the helmet and the social practices associated with that, and the mail and the social practices associated with that. So this is an example of the kind of helmet that he might have been talking about. This is the Sutton Hoo helmet, and this is a recreation of it. And what you can see is that the social practices, so warriors, dragons, horses, are actually reflected on the object itself. It's embedded within the resource. This is another example. This is an ornamental object. So this is a disc brooch. It's actually at the Met if you're inspired by my talk and want to go see it. But this is an example of ornamental detail. And what you can see from this quote and these two pictures of different resources is that they both have different social practices associated with them, and they both tell stories about the specific social practices. So when we think about resources as not being passive, but actually active, we can see them not only as things that stories are told about, but actually as storytellers themselves. So I've shown you just a few examples from Beowulf. There's a lot more about resources in both Beowulf and other Anglo-Saxon texts. But this brings me to my final point, that studying Beowulf in this way helps us understand how people have related to resources across different time spans and also geographical scales. But it also shows us how deeply embedded resources are within cultures, that they're active parts of making material culture and social practices. So to come back to what I was talking about in terms of the contemporary world and resource conflicts, I'd like to suggest that if policymakers, especially around resource conflict and cooperation, took a more holistic view of how resources are embedded within cultures, that perhaps we could move away from conflict over resources and towards more cooperation and peace. Thank you.